After my father's death, my mom mocked my art, saying I'd end up homeless like those pathetic street painters. 15 years later, my work was auctioned for $2.7 million. She showed up at the gallery, crying and saying, "I always believed in you." I turned to the crowd and said, "Let me introduce you to the woman who burned my first portfolio." They gasped because my dad was my biggest supporter growing up. He believed in my art when no one else did, especially not my mom. She was harsh about it, always calling it a waste of time, and after my dad passed away when I was 17, she got even worse. She literally burned my first real portfolio in our fireplace, saying I'd end up homeless like those street painters downtown. Fast forward 15 years, after struggling for a long time, I finally made it. I had a gallery showing a few weeks ago where my collection sold for $2.7 million. Out of nowhere, my mom showed up in tears, trying to act like she'd always been my biggest supporter. When she came up to me in front of everyone, crying and saying, "I always knew you could do it," something inside me snapped. I grabbed the mic and introduced her to the crowd as the woman who once burned my dreams. People gasped. She looked humiliated. I don't know if I was cruel or just honest. I haven't spoken to her since. Part of me feels guilty. The other part feels free. The day Dad died was the day the house went silent in a way that didn't just sound empty, it felt it. I was 17, sitting in the corner of our old living room, clutching a charcoal sketch of Dad I'd started days before but couldn't finish. Mom came home from the hospital that evening, her shoes clicking sharp against the floorboards. She didn't look at me. She dropped her purse on the kitchen counter, took off her coat, and just stared at the fireplace like she wasn't sure how she got there. When she finally spoke, it wasn't words of comfort or even acknowledgement. It was a low, sharp, tired voice. "You still wasting time with that crap?" she said, her eyes flicking to my sketchbook. I didn't answer. I just hugged the book tighter. She crossed the room in 3 fast strides, snatched the sketchbook out of my hands, and started flipping through it. Her mouth twisted as she looked at my drawings, pictures of street scenes, old houses, the broken-down swing set in our backyard. Things Dad had loved. "You think any of this matters now?" she barked. "You think this is going to keep the lights on?" I started to say something, anything, but she was already moving toward the fireplace. I watched, frozen, as she tossed my sketchbook into the flames. I ran to try to grab it, but she held me back easily. "Grow up, Mara," she said, like she was doing me a favor. "The world doesn't care about your doodles." I packed my bag that night, shaking so hard I could barely zip it closed. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay. For a while, I crashed on a classmate's couch. Claire's family didn't ask a lot of questions. They had a small, messy house near the railroad tracks, and her mom worked nights, so no one really noticed one more person eating cereal out of the box at 2 a.m. I worked 2 jobs, one at a diner during the day and another cleaning motel rooms on weekends. In every spare second, I sketched. Receipts, napkins, the back of junk mail, anything with a blank side became my canvas. When I turned 18, I scraped together enough to enroll in a small art institute. Nothing fancy, mostly night classes and part-time instructors. But it felt like a lifeline. Like a small, stubborn fire that hadn't gone out after all. Most of my classmates were younger, richer, louder. They had parents who sent them care packages and covered their tuition. I worked through every holiday and slept maybe 4 hours a night. I learned to stretch a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter over an entire week. I wasn't the best. Not technically. My lines were rough, my colors too bold. But there was something in my work, something raw, that caught the attention of Professor Gabriel Wynne. He pulled me aside after class one night, my hands still stained with paint, my stomach growling because I'd skipped dinner again. "You're not copying the world," he said quietly. "You're translating it. Don't lose that." It was the first kind thing an adult had said to me in over a year. I nearly cried right there in the hallway. Gabriel pushed me harder than anyone ever had. He showed me how to let go of perfection, how to tell a story with color and shadow, how to make people feel something ugly and beautiful at the same time. When I graduated, I moved to Atlanta because it was just close enough to home that I could pretend I wasn't running from it. I rented a tiny storage unit with a roll-up door, no windows, and a leak that dripped onto my canvases during rainstorms. It was $150 a month, and I barely made that selling sketches at flea markets and taking commissions from strangers online. There were nights when I thought Mom had been right. When the cold ate through my thrift store jacket and the only thing in my fridge was a jar of mustard. When I would sit in that storage unit, staring at a half-finished painting, wondering if it was all just stupid. But I kept going. Then, one Saturday afternoon, I was sitting at a folding table at a local art fair, my pieces spread out like a desperate yard sale, when Priya Patel walked by. She was the owner of a small but respected gallery downtown. She stopped, looked at a piece, a painting of a little girl sitting alone at a bus stop, clutching a broken umbrella, and asked quietly, "Is this yours?" I nodded, heart hammering. "I want to show your work," she said. Just like that. No hesitation. No pity. The gallery show wasn't some overnight fairy tale. 3 pieces sold. I made enough to pay rent and fix the leak in the storage unit. But one of the buyers was Marcellus Greer, a collector who knew how to spot talent before it hit big. Marcellus commissioned 3 more paintings. Then 5. Then a full series. Word spread. Slowly at first, then faster than I could keep up. Invitations to exhibit in bigger galleries, interviews, reviews. I finally moved out of the storage unit and into a cramped studio apartment that actually had heat and running water. I painted until my fingers cramped and my back ached. Until my dreams were no longer about survival, but about creating something that mattered. And somehow, 15 years after my mother threw my portfolio into the flames, I found myself standing at the opening of my first major solo exhibition at the High Museum of Art. The collection was called Ashes to Canvas. Every piece told a story of loss, anger, survival. A whole lifetime poured into 50 canvases. As the auctioneer rattled off bids, I stood in the back, sipping cheap champagne and pretending not to shake. That's when I saw her. Mom. Jolene Hastings. She looked small. Older. Worn down in a way grief alone couldn't explain. She pushed through the crowd, her heels clicking like gunshots against the polished floor, her makeup smeared from crying. She reached me just as they announced that the total sales had topped $2.7 million. "Mara," she gasped, grabbing my hands. "Oh, Mara, I always knew you'd make it." There was a microphone nearby, left behind from earlier speeches. Without even thinking, I grabbed it. The words came out steady and sharp, like I had been rehearsing them for years. "Everyone," I said, "I'd like to introduce you to the woman who burned my first portfolio. Who told me I'd end up homeless if I didn't give up my art." There was a ripple through the crowd, a sharp intake of breath, a few shocked murmurs. Mom froze, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I should have stopped there. Maybe I should have. But I didn't. Mom stood there, frozen, with dozens of eyes staring at her. Some people looked confused, others just looked uncomfortable. Priya, standing by the champagne table, had stopped mid-sip, her eyebrows raised. Even Marcellus, who's seen more wrongdoings than most, leaned slightly forward like he didn't want to miss a word. I let the microphone lower slowly. My hand wasn't even trembling. I thought it would be. I thought I would be sobbing or shaking or making a fool of myself, but I felt strangely calm. Like every ounce of fear and hurt had burned off, leaving only cold clarity. Mom's mouth moved soundlessly for a moment before she found her voice. "Mara, please," she whispered, grabbing at my wrist. Her nails dug in a little, like she could still control me the way she used to. I was scared. "I just didn't want you to waste your life." I pulled my hand free. "You didn't want me to have a life," I said, low enough that only she could hear it. "You wanted me to disappear." She flinched like I'd slapped her. Maybe I had, just not with my hands. Someone nearby cleared their throat awkwardly, and the room seemed to shift, people pretending not to eavesdrop while inching closer. The auctioneer glanced over, clearly debating whether to intervene or not. Mom wiped her cheeks furiously with the back of her hand. I made mistakes, she hissed, her voice cracking under the weight of her own humiliation. But I'm your mother. Doesn't that count for something? I wanted to laugh. I wanted to scream. I wanted to take all the paintings off the walls and shove them in her face and say, "Look what I did without you." Instead, I just looked at her. Really looked at her. For the first time in years, she didn't seem like the giant she had been in my nightmares. She was just a woman, a tired, bitter woman who had never figured out how to love something she didn't understand. "You should leave," I said quietly. For a second, she didn't move. Then she straightened her back, wiped at her face again, and walked away, her heels clicking against the floor, each step more uncertain than the last. I stood there for a long moment, the microphone dangling from my fingers, the buzz of conversation slowly rising again around me. Someone clapped me on the shoulder, "Priya, I think," but I barely registered it. The rest of the night was a blur. People congratulating me. Collectors asking about commissions. Reporters angling for interviews. I smiled when I needed to, nodded at the right times, gave polite, practiced answers. But inside, I felt hollow. Because the truth was, no amount of money, no amount of praise, no glittering exhibition could fill the crater that had been blasted into my life all those years ago. I slipped out before the after party even got into full swing. Left Priya to smooth things over, to answer the awkward questions, to spin the story however she needed to. Outside, the night was cool and still, the Atlanta skyline glittering above me like broken glass scattered across black velvet. I pulled my coat tighter around myself and started walking, no destination in mind. I ended up on a bench near Piedmont Park, the kind of place Dad would have loved. I could almost hear his voice, telling me to sit down, take a breath, watch the way the streetlights painted gold across the pavement. So I did. I sat there until my hands stopped shaking, until the adrenaline drained out of me and left only exhaustion behind. Somewhere in my bag, my phone buzzed, probably Priya or Marcellus or someone else worried about appearances. I ignored it. I thought about the paintings I'd made. About the hours I'd spent alone in that freezing storage unit, painting until my fingers cramped and my eyes burned. About the way the colors had felt under my hands, angry, desperate, alive. And I thought about Mom. About the way her face had crumpled when I spoke. About the desperate, almost feral way she had grabbed for me, like she was drowning and I was the last branch sticking out of the water. Did I feel sorry for her? Maybe. But not enough. Not enough to undo everything she had done. Not enough to forget. Around midnight, I finally checked my phone. There were 5 missed calls, all from an unknown number. A text followed, short and gutting in its simplicity, "I'm sorry. I don't know how to fix this." I stared at it for a long time, thumb hovering over the screen. I didn't reply. I didn't know what to say. Instead, I turned the phone off and shoved it back into my bag. The night air was cool against my face as I leaned back on the bench, closing my eyes, letting the sounds of the city blur into background noise. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't running toward anything. Or away from anything. I was just still. And for that moment, it was enough. The next few days blurred into a strange, restless haze. The gallery buzzed with follow-up interviews, collectors requesting private viewings, and reporters wanting the full story behind the drama. Some even hinted that the confrontation with my mother had added depth to the collection's narrative, as if real pain could be repackaged and sold like another product. Priya shielded me from most of it. She was good at that, fiercely protective in a way I hadn't realized I needed. She kept the sharks at bay while I hid out in my apartment, surrounded by stacks of untouched canvases, the smell of turpentine hanging heavy in the air. I didn't paint. I barely ate. Every time I picked up a brush, my hand froze. The colors looked too bright, too loud, too false. It was like I had squeezed every last drop of feeling into ashes to canvas, and now there was nothing left inside me but static. The text from Mom stayed on my phone, unopened but impossible to ignore. A few times, I found myself staring at it, thumb hovering over reply, wondering what I would even say. What words could possibly bridge a 15-year chasm? I thought maybe she would try again, call, email, show up at the gallery, but she didn't. The silence between us stretched longer and longer, taut as piano wire. Until a week later, when a letter arrived. A real letter. Not a text, not an email. A thin cream-colored envelope, my name written in her tight, angular handwriting. I sat at my kitchen table staring at it for hours before I finally opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, neatly folded. Mara, I'm sorry for the things I said and did when you were young. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not even sure I deserve it. I just want you to know that it wasn't about you. It was about my own fear. Fear of losing you the way I lost him. Fear of seeing you fail and not knowing how to protect you from it. I see now that I only made things worse. I hurt you when I should have lifted you up. I don't have the right to ask for a relationship. I just hope that someday you can find peace, even if I'm not part of it. I am proud of you. I was always proud. I just didn't know how to say it without sounding like I was tearing you down. I'm sorry. Mom, I read it once, then again, the words blurring a little at the edges. Part of me wanted to crumple the letter, to fling it across the room, to rage that it was too little, too late. That a few neatly penned apologies couldn't undo the years of damage. But another part, a smaller, quieter part, just felt tired. Because I could see it now, too. How scared she must have been, buried under grief and resentment and the suffocating weight of expectations. How her fear had curdled into cruelty because it was the only language she knew. It didn't excuse what she had done. Not even close. But it made her human. And somehow, that made the hurt sharper. I folded the letter carefully, slipping it back into the envelope, and tucked it into the drawer with my sketch pads and old ticket stubs and scraps of memories I wasn't ready to throw away. The next morning, I forced myself out of bed and down the creaky stairs of my apartment building. The world felt too bright, too noisy, the hum of traffic drilling into my skull. I ended up at my old storage unit, the one I had lived out of for almost 2 years. It was abandoned now. A for-lease sign hung crookedly on the chain-link fence. Still, I stood there for a long time, staring at the dented roll-up door, remembering the nights I had huddled inside, painting by the light of a single bare bulb, whispering promises to myself that one day, this would all be worth it. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel victorious. Mostly, I just felt sad. Sad for the girl who had painted through hunger and cold and loneliness. Sad for the woman who had only learned how to express love through destruction. Sad for the years that neither of us would ever get back. I walked back slowly, kicking a crushed soda can down the sidewalk like a kid. When I got home, there were 2 more texts waiting for me. Both from Mom. Just wanted to say congratulations again. I watched the interview you did with Channel 7. You looked beautiful. Dad would have been so proud. I miss you. No demands. No guilt trips. Just simple, bare statements, hanging there like questions I wasn't ready to answer. I sat down at my easel, staring at the blank canvas. My hands itched to paint again, but the images that floated in my mind were messy, tangled, confusing. Not anger, not joy, something harder to pin down. Forgiveness, maybe. Or something like it. I dipped my brush into the paint, a deep, rich blue, and made the first stroke across the canvas. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even good. But it was a start. The painting I started that day didn't end up in any gallery. It wasn't made for anyone else. It was for me. Thick, messy strokes. Raw emotion in every line. A swirl of blue, black, gold, colors of pain and hope bleeding together. I worked on it for days, sleeping in short, broken stretches. Barely eating. Barely talking. Just painting, pulling everything I'd buried inside out into the open. When I finally stepped back, I realized I hadn't just painted an image. I had painted a memory. A small girl sitting on a bench under a vast, starless sky, alone, but holding a battered sketchbook against her chest like a lifeline. For the first time in months, I cried. Not the furious, helpless tears I used to cry in that cold house on Craggy Avenue. These tears were different, softer, slower. Grief, maybe. Grief for what could have been. A week after I finished the painting, I got a call from Priya. "We have another offer," she said, trying to sound casual, but I could hear the excitement in her voice. "From the Hawthorne Foundation. They want to commission a permanent piece for their new center." The Hawthorne Foundation wasn't just some gallery. It was the foundation, one of the biggest names in arts philanthropy in the South. A deal with them could fund my work for years. I said yes. The terms were generous. My name would be on the installation. They offered a grant for a community project too, something where I could mentor young artists who didn't have family support. Kids like I had once been. It was everything I had ever wanted. And then came the kicker: they wanted to host a special unveiling ceremony. Invitations, press, speeches, the whole 9 yards. "You can bring someone, if you want," Priya added gently. I knew what she meant. For days, I wrestled with it. Bringing Mom would be a statement. Forgiveness, maybe. Or weakness. I wasn't sure. Then I realized, I didn't have to forgive her to move on. I didn't have to pretend the past hadn't happened. I just had to stop letting it define me. So I made a different plan. When the day of the ceremony came, I stood outside the gleaming new arts center, watching as the crowds arrived. Press, local officials, patrons in sleek suits and expensive shoes. I spotted her before she saw me. Mom. She was standing awkwardly near the entrance, wearing the same too small polyester suit she'd worn at the gallery. Clutching a battered leather handbag like it was a shield. Her eyes were wide, scanning the crowd for me. I waited until she saw me. Until she started to smile. Until she lifted her hand in a tentative wave. Then I turned away. And walked straight toward a group of students gathered near the entrance, teenagers in paint-splattered clothes, their arms full of sketchpads and canvases. My students. I greeted them with a wide, genuine smile. Hugged them. Laughed with them. Showed them off to the reporters like they were the real stars of the show. And when the speeches began, when Priya introduced me as the artist whose journey reminds us that even broken beginnings can create the most beautiful endings, I took the microphone and spoke not about my struggles, but about the people who had lifted me up. Claire's family, who gave me a couch to sleep on. Gabriel, who saw something worth saving. Priya, who took a chance on a girl selling paintings out of a storage unit. I never once mentioned Mom. Not her cruelty. Not her apology. Not her existence. I erased her from the story. Because sometimes, the greatest revenge isn't confrontation. It's exclusion. It's showing the world, and yourself, that you built your life without the people who tried to break you. Mom lingered at the edge of the crowd for a while, face pale, shrinking smaller and smaller as the ceremony went on without her. Eventually, she turned and left. No scene. No tears. Just the quiet sound of footsteps fading away. And me? I stayed. Laughing with my students. Shaking hands with patrons. Signing canvases. Living the life I had fought tooth and nail to build. On my terms. Without her.